Great to see you here today, and certainly already been blessed by such wonderful singing and considering what Jesus has done for us. And if you're visiting with us, we just want to welcome you. We also want to tell you that we're a big family here, and so we get to enjoy and celebrate together some good times. John and Kamiko Sweet are expecting their third child, a baby girl, on December 27th. So congratulations to the Sweets. This morning we're going to be talking kind of about the book of Philippians, but kind of not. I'll talk about that in just a moment. Before I do, though, what I'd like to say is that I was struck as Brian was leading us in our singing this morning. We used to sing this song all the time growing up, Heaven Came Down. And listen, I sit in the front, so I have no idea who's singing what and who's not singing and all that, so this is not aimed at anybody. I was just sitting there thinking, you know, I pray that each and every one of us is taking advantage of the opportunity to sing to God if we believe the words of that song and the songs that we have. Well, I mean, what did we just sing? Heaven came down. Heaven came down, and glory filled my heart. We're talking about the moment of our conversion, right? We're talking about the moment where we became Christ. What a song, you know. Thank you, Brian, for leading that. To think about not just singing it, but proclaiming it. Heaven has come down and filled my heart. Glory has filled my heart. What a wonderful thing. This morning we're going to be introducing a series of lessons on the book of Philippians, but in order to do that, we're actually going to be introducing a series of lessons on the book of Acts, but we'll get to that in a second. The book of Philippians is an important book because, well, I'll give you 3 reasons why, but there's a lot more than this. But the book of Philippians is centered on many of life's biggest questions. You think about how many coffee mugs or pictures or whatever you have in your house that have Bible verses. A lot of them come from Philippians because there's some huge kind of life verses in the book of Philippians. But the book of Philippians talks about things, answers questions like, where do I find real lasting joy? Questions like, what is my purpose in life? Questions like, how do I endure when times are difficult? How do I follow Jesus in an increasingly complicated and difficult world? Questions like, how can the church have unity and fellowship together, being a very diverse mix of people with different backgrounds, opinions, past, etc.? Many important questions the book of Philippians talks about. But what some Bible scholars will tell you about the book of Philippians is, and I don't know who counts these things, but if you were to look at the book of Philippians and you were to take 100 words from Philippians or 10 or whatever, if you were to take the book of Philippians on a per word basis, Paul uses the word gospel more in the book of Philippians than in any other book. He is just intensely focused on the good news of Jesus when he's talking to this church in Philippi. I don't know about you, but probably we live in a world where some good news would be nice for a change. It'd be nice for us to be able to take some time to be intensely focused on that good news. And we're going to find that to be focused on that good news also is to be confronted by that good news. We'll talk about that more as the series progresses. But then here's something, and this is what we're going to see this morning. I'd like for you to see that Philippi and Columbus, Georgia, are actually similar in many ways. That Paul's writings, that the writings of the New Testament in general are always relevant, but sometimes we have to do more work to try to get back into, okay, what was their life like than others? And the book of Philippians is actually an opportunity for us to see a society, see a culture that in many ways is similar to our own, facing similar challenges to our own, and therefore the book of Philippians has a lot of relevance, not just because it's inspired word of God, but also because their historical background matches in some ways our present lives, and therefore it seems to be a great book to study. However, in order to understand the book of Philippians, it's really helpful to go back and look at the birth of the Philippian church, which takes place in the book of Acts, the 16th chapter. In Acts chapter 16, really verses 6 through 40, we get this running story, a series of events of the gospel of Jesus Christ coming to Philippi and the things that take place as a result. The gospel comes into the city of Philippi, and what I'd like for us to think about is how the gospel coming into the city of Philippi is similar to the gospel coming into the city of Columbus and coming into any city. And in the course of this week and next week and maybe the week after that, depending on how much I can say here, I'd like for us to talk about really 4 things. I'd like to talk about how Acts 16 teaches us that the gospel calls us to the city, first of all, calls us to our city, really. The gospel comes in and starts converting the city. The gospel also confronts the city, and despite whatever difficulty may take place, the gospel cannot be conquered by the city. Now you say, how can you not tell us that in one sermon? Well, okay, that's fair. But we're going to talk about this morning. We're going to start with the first point here. I'll put this back just for a second if you're writing this down. The gospel calls us to the city. We get in the opening verses here in Acts chapter 16, verses 6 and following, we have this scene where Paul gets a vision of a Macedonian man. Macedonia's place in Greece, okay? So northeast part of Greece. Anyway, Paul gets this vision of someone saying, come and help us. And so Paul's going to go and preach the gospel and so forth, and we're going to come back to that in a second. But in Acts chapter 16, I want to talk to you about the city of Philippi that Paul is going to go to. Philippi is in Macedonia. It's a place in Greece that Paul goes and establishes really the first European church. But in Acts chapter 16, if you look here in verse 12, Luke writes, and from there we went to Philippi, which is a leading city of the district of Macedonia and a Roman colony. I want you to just walk with me through Philippi, and Noah's actually been to Philippi, and Avery too, I think. Avery was, yeah, so you can interview them about the pictures and all that. I don't have any of those. I just want to talk to you a little bit about the historical background of Philippi, because I think you'll find it's more similar to us than we might realize. It's a leading city, it's a Roman colony, and without, belaboring you with thousands of slides of, historical text or whatever, well, I'm just going to summarize for you some things that are true of the city of Philippi, and then, kind of ask you, are these things kind of true about us too? The city of Philippi is a city that has a proud history. Proud history. Without going too far into the weeds of the story, you remember that the Roman Republic fell when Julius Caesar refused to, cede power back to the state. You remember that Julius was assassinated, and as a result, there was some conflict taking place for who was going to control Rome. Mark Antony and Octavian joined forces. This is like in the 40s BC. Joined forces together, and they waged war against Brutus and Cassius. And there's other players in the story too, but the point is, these 4 people met in battle at Philippi. That's where That's where Octavian and Mark Antony won their decisive victory against Brutus and Cassius. It's kind of interesting. A lot of history in this city of Philippi. Well, as these things take place in history, and I'm sure that Antony and Octavian do this the whole time, after you've defeated everybody else, you turn on each other, right? So they went to war against each other, and Octavian was successful. He defeated Mark Antony. But as a way of making peace and as a way of keeping the spirit of unity and of honoring these men who were fighting for Mark Antony, he renamed it after himself, but he established Philippi as a place for Mark Antony's soldiers to basically go and work and live. And he made it a Roman colony in Greece, so that they had every single right, privilege, the architecture, the coins, everything was Roman in Philippi compared to the surrounding Greek world. So they had this proud history of where they had come from and the things that had gone on. They had a proud history of who they were as a people, their identity, but they also had a bit of a complicated past, right? Many of them actually had ancestors when Paul's writing to the Philippians. Many of them had ancestors who were on the losing side of a major battle in the region. Sound familiar, right? We're thinking about a place where there's a lot of complex emotions. There's a lot of difficult political thoughts and things going on in Rome. In Philippi. It's a place with a very interesting history. I'm not just talking about the Civil War. We got an interesting history here in Georgia because, as I've said before, when I was on jury duty, I sat there and it just hit me for the first time looking at the big seal of the state of Georgia, and it says, the state of Georgia, 1776, right? I mean, that's a pretty interesting history. There's a lot there, and much of it is something that we take pride in. It's a city with a proud history. There's also a city with a great number of, let me put it this way. It was a city comparatively with a lot of wealth. This was not Atlanta. This was not like a huge city, but it's an important city on a trade route where there was a lot of dealing of goods. We're going to find this lady Lydia in our story. She's come from Thyatira to Philippi in order to do business, okay? So it was a wealthy city, prosperous city. Now, you might say, well, Columbus, Georgia, it's not that prosperous in looking out at the national averages and all of that. But we know that we living here occupy the 1% of the globe in terms of economic prosperity. And if we don't occupy the number 1%, it's the number 2%. 98 or 99% of people in the globe, on average, have less than we have here. And so when we talk about our situation, and of course we went to Zimbabwe not long ago, and that's a very humbling thing, but the people that were living in Philippi, not at the same scale as Americans, but they were more prosperous than many people around them. And part of that is because of their connection to the Roman Empire. As I said, the people that lived in Philippi were full Roman citizens. They had every right that a Roman living in Rome, living in Italy, had in Philippi. They had the same protections, they had the same permissions, the same rights, the same privileges, whatever you want to say. They had all of the same freedoms that they had in Rome. And they were passionate about that. They were excited about that. They believed strongly in what Rome stood for, and especially the rights and freedoms that they enjoyed as citizens. They had all of these rights compared to the people around them. Again, we think about how even traveling, carrying an American passport, a United States of America passport, it almost sets your mind at peace a little, even when you're traveling, to know the country that you belong to. So we have a city of rights and freedoms as well. Also, we know archaeologically, historically, we know that the people of Philippi, they were a city that had a religious pluralism, a very pluralistic society to some degree. They had, of course, imperial cult worship. They were worshiping the emperors like you're supposed to. They were worshiping the traditional Greek gods like you would if you lived in Greece. And then they also, we've even found that they were worshiping some of the Egyptian gods, Eastern religions that were coming in to Philippi as well. So a place where there was, to some extent, governed by Roman law, there was religious pluralism, multiple religions going on at the same time. It's probably what we call syncretism, where people are worshiping, they worship here, they worship there, it doesn't really matter. We're all worshiping the same things and it's going to be fine. So it's a city of religious pluralism. I think if you look at the American landscape today, we live in an increasingly, I don't even know if it's increasing, we live in a pluralistic society. We live in a world where there's a nation where many religions are going on at the same time, and the spirit of the day is, pick the one that you like and go with it. Pick a couple if you want, doesn't really matter. So similar in many ways, the city of Philippi and our time today, and it is to this city that Paul's going to come. But I want you to think about why he goes to Philippi. I want you to think about why he goes to Greece. It's because he has a vision. Now, if you took off that one right there, a proud history, a wealthy city, a city of rights and a city of freedoms. And yet Paul gets in his vision this picture of this man crying out saying, come to Greece, come to Macedonia, come to Philippi and help us. And you're thinking, why? Why do you need help? I mean, look at what you've got. You got religious freedoms, you've got all these other rights, you got wealth, you got this great national, this great history of your city, and you got this place in the Roman Empire. You're like a little Rome with the coins and architecture. They speak Latin there. I mean, it's Rome. What do you need help? Why do you need help? And what's even more interesting, if you look here, in Acts chapter 16, in verse 10, when Paul had seen the vision, immediately we sought to go into Macedonia. Now look at this. Concluding that God had called us to proclaim the gospel to them, the good news. There's that word Paul's going to use more in Philippians per word than anywhere else. When the Macedonians are calling out in this vision, he sees this person saying, help us. Paul concludes that they need help. Maybe they need a lot of help in Macedonia. Maybe they need, different programs. Maybe they have poverty in certain areas. Maybe they need education. There's all kinds of needs undoubtedly they had. But Paul heard the cry for help, and he said what they need most is the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, we live in a place very similar to this. And I can tell you that God is telling the church through Acts 16 and through all kind of other passages that no matter how proud the city, no matter how wealthy the city, no matter how the human rights are being taken care of in the city, no matter how tolerant the city is, what the city needs more than anything else is the good news of Jesus Christ. That's what our city needs more than anything else. And as Micah Cobb so powerfully reminded us on Wednesday, that's the mission of the church, is to bring the gospel to our city, to proclaim the good news, not just so that we can convert people to Christ, but so that we can all grow up to the full measure of Christ, so that we can become mature in Christ, so that we can grow as believers in Jesus, so that we could be transformed from one image to the next, as Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 3. So as we think about Paul and his call to the city and our call to our city, I want us to spend some time thinking about how the gospel converts people in the city. Now, if you look here in Acts chapter 16, you have 3 conversions. Two very notable conversions and one that doesn't get as much press, but 3 conversions. There's a conversion, and I'll put them up here. There's 3 people. There's the conversion of Lydia and her household subsequently. Then Paul's interaction with the slave girl who we'll see is demon-possessed. And then Paul's interaction with the man who's often called the Philippian jailer in Acts 16, 25 through 34. 3 different people with 3 very different backgrounds, 3 very different pasts, 3 very different places, spiritual states, however you want to describe it. In fact, think about it. These people have very different life situations. If you think about Lydia, what we find out about Lydia in Acts chapter 16, verse 14, is there was a woman who heard us named Lydia from the city of Thyatira, a seller of purple goods, really of fine clothing, who was a worshiper of God. Lydia is a wealthy businesswoman who's going to end up hosting Paul after she converts to Christ. She's this businesswoman who's traveled to Philippi, and she's a seller of these fine goods. So she has, this unique position in the city compared to a lot of other people. She's got wealth and prosperity. She also believes in God. So she's coming at a very different position than we find the next person who is an oppressed slave. If you look here in Acts 16, you go down, and by the way, there's no way I'm going to be able to read 40 verses or whatever, so please read this on your own time as well. But if you look down in verse 16, As we were going to the place of prayer, we were met by a slave girl who had a spirit of divination and brought her owners much gain by fortune telling. Now, it's interesting in verse 17, she followed Paul and us, crying out, "These men are servants of the Most High God who proclaim to you the way of salvation." And she kept doing this for many days, and Paul, becoming greatly annoyed, turned and said to the spirit, "I command you in the name of Jesus Christ, come out of her." And it came out of her that very hour. Now, people have a lot of questions about that story, and if I don't answer them all, I'm sorry, but I'm going to try to answer a couple. One of the first questions people have is, why is this demon-possessed woman crying out, here's these people proclaiming salvation through Jesus Christ. Why on earth would a demon want to be advertising for Jesus? Well, if you think about it, there's probably two reasons. The first reason is guilt by association. If a demon is crying out, if a crazy person, right, is crying out, "This is the way you should follow," you're probably not going to be very likely to listen to that person, because you say, if she's believing it, I don't want to believe it. Maybe also, though, there's that idea of syncretism, religious syncretism, where the demon is saying, hey, here's the Most High God, you want to follow Him, but she's also a predictor of the future, and she's an oracle and whatnot. Her owners seem to have no problem with her making these proclamations, right? Because she's not really threatening them. She's actually reducing the gospel, perhaps, to just another way that you can follow, or another God that you can worship, and things will be well for you. It's difficult to say for sure. One reason or another, she's doing it, and Paul lets her do it for many days. And people wonder, how come Paul didn't cast this thing out from the very moment that it started speaking? Did he not know? No, he knew. You don't get the sense that Paul's like, maybe that's a demon, you know? No. I think Paul knows what's going to happen when he casts her out, which is he's going to be thrown in jail. Casts out the demon. He's going to be thrown in jail. So Paul wants to try his best to preach and preach and preach and preach until he can go no further, and then he's going to cast the demon out, he's going to be thrown in prison, and so forth and so on. Anyway, that's just some backstory about that. There's a wealthy businesswoman, there's this oppressed slave, and then I'm going to call the Philippian jailer a stressed employee. Okay, I'm taking a little bit of liberty here, but probably the jailer is a retired Roman soldier, most likely, just based on the historical probabilities. As such, he's in charge of making sure the prisoners don't escape, but it's not like a casual 9-to-5 job. When Peter is rescued by the Lord from Herod's prison, and he gets out, what happens to the guards that are watching Peter? They're killed. So the Philippian jailer is working a job for the government, and the stakes are very high. Can you imagine how stressed you would be if one of your prisoners escaped, you were dead? I mean, that's a pretty serious job. So we have people from all kinds of different backgrounds here, all kinds of different situations. And we also here have people in 3 different spiritual states. On the one hand, we have Lydia, and she's seeking and open to Jesus, right? She's gathering there at the river with some ladies, and we don't know where the husbands are. If there are husbands, maybe they're widows, maybe their husbands are just not interested, I don't know. But they're gathered there, and they're there to pray. And Paul goes, and he opens the Scriptures with them, and he teaches them. And the Scriptures say in verse 14 here, the Lord opened her heart to pay attention to what was said by Paul. She's listening, she's engaged, she's seeking. Then you have the demon-possessed woman who, and I have no idea, I mean, we're not going to get into all of the backstory of how this lady got demon-possessed. The text doesn't say, but I can say that in her current state, she was antagonistic toward Jesus, right? The demon working through her was working to thwart what Paul was doing. So we have somebody who's antagonistic to Jesus, and then we have the jailer who's just doing his job. I mean, he's indifferent towards Jesus in the story. We have no reason to think that he's for him or against him. He's just keeping him in jail. That's what he does as a jailer. He's doing his job. And he's doing it honorably, right? He's prepared to fall on his sword when they're not found because he'd rather die in an honorable way than for them to put him to death in a dishonorable way. So the point is, you have these three different people, three different backgrounds, three different spiritual states. And what I'd like for us to think about today is that when the gospel comes to the city, and this is really where we're going with all of this, when the gospel comes to the city, the gospel comes to different people in different ways. The seeking person is going to receive the message differently than the antagonistic and the indifferent, but the gospel can reach all of these people. The gospel can reach someone who's seeking. The gospel can eventually reach someone who's antagonistic. The gospel can reach somebody even who's indifferent, but it happens in different ways. If you look at Lydia, in verse 14, Paul showed her, the Lord opened her heart to understand, to believe the truth about Jesus. If you think about it in those terms, Paul converts Lydia with what you might call gospel knowledge, gospel truth, the proclamation of what Jesus has done. She's open to receiving it. She receives it, she believes it, and that's good. If you look at the slave woman, what it takes for her to be brought to a new place is a demonstration of what you might call gospel power. I mean, he says, in the name of Jesus Christ, get out. We'll make a connection to that in just a second with us today. And then when you think about the Philippian jailer, what was it that converted the Philippian jailer? Well, Paul and the people stayed in prison, and he came in and he was so moved by their willingness to suffer that he said, what do I need to do to be saved? I want what you have. But I want you to think even back a little bit further in Acts 16. How come all those people stayed? Well, what I know is in Acts 16, verse 25, about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. If Lydia is converted with gospel knowledge, the antagonistic, demon-possessed woman is converted with gospel power, the jailer, in some sense, is converted by gospel worship. In Acts 16:25, through the singing and the prayers, and then in Acts 16:28, by their staying there, aren't they doing what Paul says in Romans chapter 12, presenting themselves as a living sacrifice for the sake of Christ? That's what they're doing. There's this worship that is taking place here in Acts 16 that is so moving to the Philippian jailer. Now, let me talk about converting Columbus. This is my last slide, converting Columbus. Let's think about the gospel in our city, and let's think about how important it is for us to understand that the gospel is going to reach different people in our city in different ways. And it's a gospel for different people. It's a gospel for all people, right? When Paul comes into the city, he's talking to wealthy people, poor people. He's talking to people on the outside of the city at the river and in the very heart of the city in the jail. I mean, he's talking to all people about Jesus Christ. But when the gospel comes to people, depending on where they're at, it comes in different ways. Some people are going to be converted by the gospel truth. In other words, by why the gospel makes sense of life. By why the gospel provides the answer, how Jesus' resurrection is reliable and historical. And there's all kinds of apologetic arguments, and things. There's all kinds of truths that can be used when a person is seeking and open to knowing more about Jesus. That's how Lydia was converted, right? She had her mind open, she was reading, she was studying, she was converted. At the same time, other people are going to need to see not merely the truth of the gospel, but they're going to need to see the power of the gospel. They're going to need to see why the gospel helps people in the world today. Not just why it makes good sense in terms of logical, rational arguments, but in terms of actually looking out and seeing, wow, gospel people, Jesus followers, are interested in serving. They're interested in justice. They're interested in caring for people in the community. And so if somebody is antagonistic toward Jesus, you can make all the arguments you want, but what they're really going to need to see is they're going to have to see unmistakable gospel power to be able to say, I've looked for every reason not to believe this, but I just can't believe that God isn't at work when I look and see what you guys are doing. Gospel truth, gospel power. Finally, and this I think is very important, the Philippian jailer, he's indifferent. His heart's just kind of numbed all this. I mean, he's just at work. And really what gets him is wonder. Maybe another word would be awe. But that's the heart behind worship, right? Worship is to come with awe before God, to fall down at God's feet. And when the Philippian jailer came in and he saw those cells were still full, you know what he did? He fell at the apostles' feet. So, what do I need to do to be saved? Why? He was in awe. He was wondering at what had just happened. He was marveling at what had just happened. He wasn't convinced by some argument. He wasn't even convinced by some great display of power, although there's the earthquake and all of that. Really, he was being converted by seeing the wonder of the gospel. And if we're going to show the wonder of the gospel to our world, to people that are indifferent, if we're going to have their hearts be pierced, if God is going to pierce their heart, we're going to need to show them not just why the gospel is true or helpful, but why the gospel is also beautiful. Why the gospel is more satisfying than anything else in all the world. That's kind of the attitude behind the very famous saying of Augustine, right? Our hearts are restless until they find rest in you. That people need to be able to see and say, only the gospel of Jesus can sustain my soul in the darkest day. Only the gospel of Jesus has this secret joy that I can access that can't be taken from me. Only in Jesus do I have my heart open so profoundly that heaven can come down and glory can fill my soul. When we think about the gospel in the city, we're going to talk about the gospel confronting the city next week. But for now, I want you to think about our church and think about how can we grow in proclaiming the truth, in working the power, and in demonstrating the wonder of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And if you're here today and we can help you, maybe you're here visiting with us, I just want to say, if you're visiting with us, I want to tell you how thankful we are for you being here, but we also want to invite you back to come again. We want to invite you back to consider more about the truth, the power, and the wonder of what Jesus Christ is doing. And if we can help you in any way, you're invited to come as we stand and sing.